World of Warcraft, The Last Guardian, by Jeff Grubb. To Chris Menson, who kept the vision. Prologue. The Lonely Tower. The larger of the two moons had risen first this evening, and now hung pregnant and silver-white against a clear, star-draped sky. Beneath the lambent moon, the peaks of the Red Ridge Mountains strained for the sky in the daylight. In the daylight, the sun picked out hues of magenta and rust among the great granite peaks, but in the moonlight, they were reduced to tall, proud ghosts. To the west lay the forest of Elwyn. Its heavy canopy of great oaks and stained woods ran from the foothills to the sea to the east. The bleak swamp of the Black Morass spread out, a land of marshes and low hills, bayous and backwaters, filled settlements and lurking danger. A shadow passed briefly across the moon, a raven-sized shadow, bearing from a hole in the heart of the mountain. Here, a chunk had been pulled from the fastness of the Red Ridge Range, leaving behind a circular veil. Once, it might have been the site of some primeval celestial impact or the memory of an earth-shaking explosion. But the eons had worn the bowl-shaped crater into a series of steeped edges, rounded hillocks, where now, cradled by the steep mountains surrounding them, none of the ancient trees of Elwyn could reach its altitude. And the interior of the ringed hills was barren, save for weeds and tangled vines. At the center of the ringed hills lay a bare tear, as bald as the plate of a Kulturas merchant. Lord. Indeed, the very way the hillock rose steeply, then gented to a near-level slope at its apex, was similar to the shape of a human skull. Many had noted it over the years, though only a few had been sufficiently brave or powerful or tactless to mention its properties to the owner. At the flattened peak of the Tor rose an ancient tower, a thick, massive protrusion of white stone and dark mortar, a man-made eruption that shot effortlessly into the sky, scaling higher than the surrounding mountains, lit like the beacon by the moonlight. There was a low wall at the base of the tower surrounding a bailey, and within those walls the tumble-down remains of a stable and a smithy, but the tower itself dominated all within the ringed hills. Once this place was called Karazhan. Once it was home to the last of the mysterious and secretive guardians of Chiristfall. Once it was a living place. Now it was simply abandoned and time lost. There was silence upon the tower, but not a stillness. In the night's embrace, quiet shapes filtered from the window to window, and phantoms danced along the balconies and parapets. Less than ghosts, but more than memories. These were nothing less than pieces of the past that had become unstuck from the flow of time. These shadows of the past had been pried loose by the madness of the tower's owner, and were now condemned to play out their histories again and again, in the silence of the abandoned tower. Condemned to play, but denied of any audience to appreciate them. Then, in the silence, there was a soft scrape of a booted foot against stone, then another. A flash of movement beneath the lambent moon, a shadow against the white stone, a flutter of tattered red hue cloaked in the cool night air. A figure walked alone to the topmost parapet on the crenelled uppermost spire that years before had served as an observatory. The parapet door into the observatory screeched open on ancient hinges, then stopped. Frozen by rust in the passage of time, the cloaked figure paused for a moment, then placed a finger on the hinge and muttered a few choice words. The door swung open silently. The hinges made as if anew. The trespasser allowed himself a smile. The observatory was empty now, but tools that remained smashed and abandoned, The trespassing figure, almost as silent as a ghost himself, picked up a crushed astrolabe. Its scale twisted in some now forgotten rage. Now it is merely a heavy piece of gold, inert and useless in his hands. There was another movement in the observatory, and the trespasser looked up. Now a ghostly figure stood nearby one of the many windows. The ghost/non-ghost was a broad-shouldered man, hair and beard once dark but now going to premature gray at the edges. The figure was one of the shards of the past, unglued and now repeating its task, regardless of whether it had observers or not. For the moment, the dark-haired man held an astrolabe, the unbroken twin to the one in the trespasser's hands, and fiddled with a small knob along one side. A moment, a check, and a twitch of the knob. His dark brows furrowed over ghostly green eyes. A second moment, another cheek, another check, and another twist, or twitch. Such hauntings were common even in the days when Karazhan was inhabited, though now, stripped of the control and the madness of their master, they had become more brazen. Yet these shards of the past belonged here, while he did not. He was the interloper, not they. The trespasser crossed the room to its staircase leading down, while behind him the older man flickered back into view and repeated his actions, sighting his astrolabe on the planet, then had long since moved to other parts of the sky. The trespasser moved down through the tower, crossing levels to reach another stairs and other hallways. No door was shut to him, even those locked and bolted or sealed by rust and age. A few words, a touch, a gesture, and a fettering flew loose. And the fetters flew loose. The rust dissolved to ruddy piles, the hinges restored. In one or two places, ancient wards still glowed, potent despite their age. He paused for them for a moment, considering, reflecting, searching his memory for the correct countersign. He spoke the correct word, made the correct motion with his hands, shattered the weak magic that remained, and passed on. As he moved through the tower, the phantoms of the past grew more agitated and more active. Now with a potential alliance. It seemed that these pieces of the past wished to play themselves out, if only to be made free of this place. Any sound they once possessed had long since eroded away, leaving only their images moving through the halls. The interloper passed an ancient butler in dark livery. The frail old man shuffling slowly down the empty hallway, carrying a silver tray and wearing a set of horse blinders. The interloper passed through the library, where a green-fleshed young woman stood, with her back to him, poring over an ancient tome. He passed through a banquet hall. At one end, a group of musicians played soundlessly. Dancers twirled in a gravo. At the other end, a great city burned, its flames beating ineffectively against the stone walls and rotting tapestries. The trespasser moved through the silent flames, but his face grew drawn and tense as he witnessed once more the mighty city of Stormwind burning around him. In one room, 3 young men sat around a table and told now unknown lies. Metal mugs were scattered on the table's surface as well as beneath it. Tavernus brought another round. Then he shook his head and pressed on. He reached nearly the ground level and stepped out on a low balcony that hung precariously to the wall like a wasp's nest over a main entrance. There, in the wide space before the tower, between the main entrance and the now collapsed stables across the bailey, stood a single ghostly image, lonely and separated. It did not move like the others, but rather stood there, waiting tentatively. A piece of the past that had not been released. A piece that was waiting for him. The immobile image was of a young man with a shrunk stripe of white running through his dark, untidy head of hair. The strangling fragments of a beard, newly grown, clung to his face. A battered rucksack lay at the youth's feet, and he held a red-sealed letter with a death-like grip. This was well and truly no ghost. The trespasser knew, though the owner of this image may yet be dead. Fallen in combat beneath a foreign sun, this was a memory, a shard of the past. Trapped like an insect in amber, waiting for its release, waiting for his arrival. The trespasser sat on the stonework ledge of the balcony and looked out, beyond the bailey, beyond the hillock, beyond the ring hills. There was silence in the moonlight, as the mountains themselves seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for him. The trespasser lifted a hand and intoned a series of chanted words. Softly came the rhythms and rhymes. The first time, then louder, and finally louder still. Shattering the calm in the distance, wolves picked up his chanting and cast it back in howl counterpoint. And the image of the ghostly youth, its feet seemingly trapped in mud, took a deep breath, hoisted his rucksack of secrets onto his shoulder, and slogged his way towards the main entrance of Medivh's tower. Chapter 1. Karazhan. Khadgar clutched the crimson-sealed letter of introduction and desperately tried to remember his own name. He had ridden for days, accompanying various caravans and finally making the journey alone to Karazhan through the vast overgrown woods of Elwyn. Then the long climb into the heights of the mountains to the serene, empty, lonely place. Even the air felt cold and apart. Now, sore and tired, the scruffy, bearded young man stood in the gathering dusk of the courtyard, petrified of what he must now do. Introduce himself to the most powerful mage of Azeroth. An honor, the scholars of the Kirin Torah said, an opportunity they insisted that was not to be missed. Khadgar's sage mentors, a conclave of influential scholars and sorcerers, told him that they had been trying to instate a sympathetic ear in the Tower of Karazhan for years. The Kirin Torah wanted to learn what knowledge the most powerful wizard in the land had hidden away in his library. They wanted to know what research he favored, and most of all, they wanted this maverick mage to start planning for his legacy. Wanted to know when the great powerful Medivh planned to train an heir. The great Medivh and the Kirin Torah had been at loggerheads on these and other matters for years. Apparently, and only now did he relent to some of their entries. Only now would he take on an apprentice. Whether it was from softening of the wizard's reportedly hard heart, or more diplomatic concessions, or a feeling of the mage's own creeping morality, it did not matter to Khadgar's masters. The simple truth was this powerful, independent, and to Khadgar, mysterious wizard, had asked for an assistant, and the Kirin Tor, which ruled over the magical kingdom of Dalaran, were more than happy to comply. So the youth Khadgar was selected and shuttled off with a list of directions, orders, counter-orders, requests, suggestions, advice, and other demands his sorceress masters were needed. Ask Medivh about his mother's battle with demons, asked Guzba, his first instructor. Find out all you can about elven history from his libraries, requested Lady Daleth. Check his volumes for any bestiaries, commanded Enola, who was convinced there was a fifth species of troll, as yet unrecorded in her own volumes. Be direct, forthright, and honest, advised Norland, the chief artificer. The great Magus Medivh seemed to value those traits. Be diligent, and do what you're told. Don't slouch. Always seem interested, stand up straight, and above all, keep your ears and eyes open. The ambitions of the Kirin Tor did not bother Khadgar horribly. His upbringing in Dalaran and his early apprenticeship to the Conclave made it clear to him that his mentors were inescapably cautious about magic in all its forms. The continual acclamation, catalog, and definition of magic were imprinted on young students at an early age, and Khadgar was no different than most. Indeed, he realized his own curiosity may have accounted for his current plight. His own nocturnal wanderings through the halls of the Violet Citadel of Darlaron had uncovered more than a few secrets that the Conclave would rather have not nosed about. The chief artificer's fondness for flame wine, for example, or Lady Daleth's preference for young cavaliers, a slender fraction of her age, or Corrigan, the librarian's secret collection of pamphlets describing in lurid fashion the practices of historical demon worshippers. There was something about one of the greatest sages of Dalaran, Venerable Orexus, one of the great emissaries that even the others respected. He had disappeared or died, or something horrible had happened, and the others chose to make no mention of it, even to the point of excusing Orexus' name from the volumes and not speaking of him again. But Khadgar found out, nonetheless. Khadgar, a way of finding out necessary references, making the needed connections, or talking to the right person at the right time. It was a gift, and many yet prove to be its curse. Any one of these discoveries could have resulted in his drawing his egregious, and for all the planning and warning potential fatal, assignment. Perhaps they had thought young Khadgar was a little too good at ferreting out secrets. Easier for the Conclave to send him somewhere where his curiosity would do some good for the Kirin Tor. Or at least put him far enough away so he wasn't finding things out about the other natives of the Violet Citadel. And Khadgar, through his relentless eavesdropping, had heard of that theory as well. So, Khadgar sent out with a rucksack filled with notes, a heart filled with secrets, and a head filled with strong demands and useless advice. In the final weeks before leaving Darlaron, he had heard from nearly every member of the Conclave, each of whom was interested in something about Medivh, for a wizard living on the butt end of nowhere, surrounded by trees and ominous peaks. Members of the Kirin Tor were extremely curious about him. Urgent, even. Taking a deep breath, and in doing so reminding himself that he still was too close to the stables, Khadgar strode forward toward the tower itself, his feet feeling like he was pulling his pack pony along by his ankles. The main entrance yawned like a cavern's mouth, without gate or portcullis that made sense. For what army would fight its way through the force of Elwyn to top the rounded walls of the crater, all to find the Magus Medivh himself? There was no record of anyone or anything even attempting to besiege Karazhan. The shadowed entrance was tall enough to let an elephant in full livery pass beneath. Overhanging it slightly was a wide balcony with a balustrade of white stone. From that perch, one would be level with the surrounding hills and gain a view of the mountains beyond. There was a flicker of motion along the balustrade, a bit of movement that Khadgar felt more than actually witnessed. A robed figure, perhaps, moving back along the balcony into the tower itself. Was he being watched even now? Was there no one too great to greet him, or was he expected to brave the tower on his own? "Are you the new young man?" A soft, almost skeptical voice, and Khadgar, his head still craned upwards, nearly jumped out of his skin. He wheeled to see a stooped, thin figure emerge out of the shadow of the entranceway. The stooped thing looked marginally human, and for the moment Khadgar wondered if Medivh was mutating forest animals to work as his servants. This one looked like a hairless weasel. Its long face was framed by what looked like a pair of black rectangles. Khadgar didn't remember making any response, but the weasel person stepped further from the shadows and repeated himself. "Are you the new young man?" it said. Each word was induced with its own breath, encapsulated in its own little box. Capitalized and separate from the others, it stepped from the shadows fully and revealed itself as nothing more or less threatening than a whip-slender elderly man in dark, worsened livery. A servant. Human, but a servant. It, or rather he, was still wearing black rectangles at the side of his head, like a set of earmuffs that extended forward to his most prominent nose. The youth realized that he was staring at the old man. "Khadgar," he said, and after a moment presented the tightly held letter of introduction. "Of Dalaran. Khadgar of Dalaran, in the kingdom of Lordaeron. I was sent by the Kirin Tor from the Violet Citadel. I am Khadgar of the Kirin Tor from the Violet Citadel of Dalaran of Lordaeron." He felt like he was casting controversial stones into a great empty well, hoping that the old man would respond to any of them. "Of course you are, Khadgar," said the old man. "Of the Kirin Tor. Of the Violet Citadel. Of Dalaran. Of Lordaeron." The servant took the pre-offered letter as if the document were a live reptile, and after smoothing out its crumpled edges, tucked it inside his livery vest without opening it. After carrying and protecting it for so many miles, Khadgar felt a pain of loss. The letter of introduction represented his future, and he was loth to see it disappear even for a moment. The Kirin Tor sent me to assist Medivh, Lord Medivh. The wizard Medivh of Karazhan. Khadgar realized he was but a half step from collapsing into the full-fledged babble, and with a definitive effort tightly clamped his mouth shut. "I'm sure they did," said the servant. "Send you, that is." He praised the seal on the letter, and a thin hand dripped into his waistcoat, pulling out a set of black rectangles bound by a thin band of metal. "Blinders?" Khadgar blinked. "No? No, thank you." "Morose," said the servant. Khadgar shook his head. "I am Morose," the servant said, "steward of the tower. Castellan to Medivh. Blinders?" Again he rose the black rectangle twins to those that framed his narrow face. Thank you. Morose," said Khadgar. His face twisted in curiosity. The servant turned and mentioned that Khadgar follow with a weak wave of the arm. Khadgar picked up his rucksack and had to lop forward to catch up with the servant. For all his supposed frailty, the steward moved at a good clip. "Are you alone in the tower?" Khadgar ventured as they started climbing a curved set of wide, low stairs. The stone dipped in the center, worn by myriad feet of passing servants and guests. "Eh?" responded the servant. "Are you alone?" repeated Khadgar, wondering if he would be reduced to speaking as Morose spoke to others to be understood. "Do you live here by yourself?" "The Magus is here," responded Morose in a wheezing voice that sounded as faint and as fatal as grave dust. "Yes, of course. said Khadgar. Wouldn't be much point for you to be here if he wasn't, continued the steward. Here, that is. Khadgar wondered if the old man's voice sounded that way because it was not used that often. Of course, agreed Khadgar. Anyone else? You, now, continued Morose. More work to take care of two than one. Not that I was consulted. So just you and the wizard then, normally, said Khadgar, wondering if the steward had been hired or created for his tentative nature. And Cook, said Morose, though Cook doesn't talk much. Thank you for asking, though. Khadgar tried to restrain himself from rolling his eyes, but failed. He hoped that the blinders on either side of the steward's face kept the servant from seeing his response. They reached a level spot, a cross hallway lit by torches. Morose crossed immediately to another set of saddle-worn, curved stairs opposite them. Khadgar paused for a moment to examine the torches. He raised a hand mere inches from the flickering flame, but felt no heat. Khadgar wondered if the cold flame was common throughout the tower. In Dalaran, they used photophorensis crystals, which beamed with a steady, constant glow, though his research spoke of reflective mirrors, elemental spirits bound within the lanterns, and in one case, huge captive fireflies. Yet those flames seemed to be frozen in place. Morose half-mounted up the next staircase, slowly turned and let out a gasping cough. Khadgar hurried to catch up. Apparently the blinders did not limit the old steward that much. Why the blinders? Khadgar asked. Eh? Replied Morose. Khadgar touched the side of his head. Blinders? Why? Morose twisted his face in what Khadgar could only assume was a smile. Magic's strong here. Strong and wrong. Sometimes you see things around here. Unless you are careful, I'm careful. Other visitors, the ones before you, they were less careful. They're gone now. Khadgar thought the phantom he may or may not have seen on the overhanging balcony and nodded. Cook has a set of rose quartz lenses, added Morose. Swears by them. He paused for a moment and then added, Cook is a bit foolish that way. Khadgar hoped that Morose would be more chatty once he warmed up. So you've been in the Magus' household for long? Eh? Said Morose again. You've been with Medivh long? Khadgar said, hoping to keep the impatience out of his voice. Yep, said the steward. Long enough. Too long. Seems like years. Times like that here. The withered steward let his voice trail off, and the two climbed in silence. What do you know of him? Ventured Khadgar finally. The Magus, I mean. Question is, said Morose, pulling open yet another door to reveal yet another staircase up. What do you know? Khadgar's own research in the matter was surprisingly unproductive, and his results were frustratingly sparse. Despite access to the Violet Citadel's grand library and surreptitious access to a few private libraries and secret collections, there was precious little on this great and powerful Medivh. It was doubly odd, since every elder mage in Dalaran seemed to hold Medivh in awe and wanted one thing or another from him. Some favor, some boon, some bit of information. Medivh was apparently a young man, as wizards went. He was merely in his 40s, and for a grand bulk of that time seemed to have made no impact whatsoever on his surroundings. This was a surprise to Khadgar. Most of the tales he had heard and read described independent wizards as being extremely showy, fearless in dabbling in secrets man was not meant to know, and usually died, crippled or damned from messing with powers and energies beyond their kin. Most of the lessons he had learned as a child about non-Dalaran mages always ended in the same fashion, without restraint, control, and thought. The wild, untrained, and self-taught wizards always came to a bad end. Sometimes, though not often, destroying a large amount of the surrounding countryside with them. The fact that Medivh had failed to bring a castle down on top of himself, or disperse his atoms across the twisting nether, or summon a dragon without knowing how to control that dragon, indicated either great restraint or great power. From the fuss that the scholars had made about his appointment and the list of instructions he had received, Khadgar decided on the latter. Yet, for all his research, he could not figure out why. Nothing indicated any great research of Medivh's, any major discovery, nor any ground-shaking achievement that would account for the obvious awe in which the Kirin Tor held this independent mage. No huge wars, great conquests, or no mighty battles. The bards were noticeably sketchy when it came to the matters involving Medivh. And otherwise diligent heralds nodded when it came time to discuss his accomplishments. And yet, realized Khadgar, there was something important here. Something that created in the scholars of a mixture of fear, respect, and envy. The Kirin Tor held no other spellcasters as their equals for magical knowledge. Indeed, often sought to hinder those wizards who did not hold allegiances to the Violet Citadel. And yet they kowtowed to Medivh. Why? Khadgar had only the smallest bits. A bit on his parentage. Gooseball was particularly interested in Medivh's mother. Some margin notes on a grimoire invoking his name, and a mention of the occasional visit to Dalaran. All of these visits were within the past 5 years, and apparently Medivh met only with elder mages, such as the now missing Erexis. To sum up, Khadgar knew precious little of the supposedly great mage he was assigned to work for, and as he considered knowledge to be his armor and sword, he felt woefully under-equipped for the coming encounter. Out loud, he said, "Not much." "Eh?" responded Morose, half turning on the staircase. "I said I don't know much," said Khadgar, louder than he meant to. His voice bounced off the bare walls of the staircase. It was curved now, and Khadgar was wondering if the tower was truly as high as it seemed. Already his thighs were aching from the climb. "Oh, of course you don't," said Morose. "No, that is. Young people never know much. That is what makes them young, I suppose." "I mean," said Khadgar, irritated. He paused and took a deep breath. "I mean, I don't know much about Medivh. You asked." Morose held for a moment, his foot poised on the next step. "I suppose I did," he said at last. "What is he like?" asked Khadgar, his voice almost pleading. "Like everyone else, I suppose," said Morose. "Has his darthras, has his moods, Good days and bad, like everyone else. Puts his pants on one leg at a time, said Kagar, sighing. No. He levitates into them, said Morose. The old servant looked at Kagar, and the youth caught the slightest tug of a smile along the old man's face. One more set of stairs. The final set of stairs curled tightly, and Kagar guessed that they had to be near the tower's highest spire. The old servant led the way. The stairway opened up on a small circular room, surrounded by a wide parapet. As Kagar had surmised, they were at the topmost tip of the tower, the large observatory. The walls and ceilings were pierced by crystalline windows, clear and unfogged. In the time of their climb, night had fallen fully, and the sky was dark and soon with stars. The observatory itself was dim, lit by a few torches of the same unwavering light as found everywhere else. Yet these were hooded. The lamps banked for observing the night sky. An unlit brazier sat in the middle of the room in preparation for later, as the temperature would drop toward morning. Several large curved tables spread around the outer wall of the observatory, decked with all manner of devices. Silver levels and golden astrolabes acted as paperweights or falscope, or as bookmarks, keeping ancient texts open on certain pages. A half-dissembled model, showing planetary movement through the celestial vault, sat on one table. Fine wares and additional beads laid out among the delicate tools next to it. Notebooks lay stacked against one wall, and others were in crates jammed beneath the tables. A map of the continent was stretched on a frame, showing the southern isles of Azeroth and Kagar's own Lordaeron, as well as the reclusive dwarven and elven kingdoms of Khazmodan and Quel'Thalas. Numerous small pins predecked the map, constellations that only Medivh could decipher. And Medivh was there, for to Kagar it could be no other. He was a man of middling years, his hair long, bound in a ponytail in the back. In his youth his hair had been lightly embroidered ebon black, but now was already turning gray at the temples and along the beard. Kagar knew that this happened to many mages from the stresses of the magical energies they wielded. Medivh was dressed in robes suitable for a mage, well cut and fitted to his large frame. A short tabard, unadorned by decoration, hung to his waist, over trousers tucked into oversized boots. A heavy maroon cloak hung from his broad shoulders, the hood pulled back. As Kagar's eyes adjusted to the darkness, he realized that he was wrong about the wizard's clothing being unadorned. Instead, it was laced with a silver filigree of such delicate nature that it was invisible at first blush. Looking at the mage's back, Kagar realized he was looking at the stylized face of some ancient demon legend. He blinked, and in that time the tracery transformed himself into a coiled dragon, and then into the night sky. Medivh had his back to the old servant and the young man, ignoring them entirely. He was standing at one of the tables, a golden astrolabe in one hand, and a notebook in the other. He seemed lost in thought, and Kagar wondered if this was one of the things that Morose had warned him about. Kagar cleared his throat and took a step forward, but Morose raised a hand. Kagar froze in place, and surely as if transfixed with a magical spell. Instead, the old servant walked quietly to one side of the master mage, waiting for Medivh to recognize his presence. A minute passed. A second minute. Then appeared that Kagar swore was an eternity. Finally, the robed figure stepped down his astrolabe, and made 3 quick jots in the notebook. He closed the book with a sharp snap and looked over at Morose. Seeing his face for the first time, Kagar thought that Medivh was much older than his supposed 40-plus years. The face was deeply lined and worn. Khadgar wondered what magics Medivh wielded that wrote such a deep history on his face. Morose dipped into his vest and brought out the crumpled letter of introduction. The crimson seal now bloodied. Blood. The crimson seal now blood red in the steady, unflickering torchlight. Medivh turned and regarded the youth. The mage's eyes were deeply set beneath his dark, heavy brows, but Khadgar was aware at once of the power within. Something danced and flickered within those deep green eyes, something powerful and perhaps uncontrolled, something dangerous. Master Mage glanced at him, and in a moment Khadgar felt that the wizard had taken in his sum total existence, and found it to be no more intriguing than that of a beetle or a flea. Medivh looked away from Khadgar and at the still sealed letter of introduction. Khadgar felt himself relax almost immediately, as if a large and hungry predator had stalked past him without giving him a second look. His relief was short-lived. Medivh did not open the letter. Instead, his brows furrowed only slightly, and the parchment burst into flames with an explosive rush of air. The flames clustered at the far end of the document from where Medivh held it, and flickered with an intense blue flame. When Medivh spoke, his voice was both deep and amused. "So," said Medivh, oblivious to the fact that he was holding Khadgar's future in his burning hands, "it seems our young spy has arrived at last." Chapter 2. Interview with the Magus. "Is something wrong?" asked Medivh, and Khadgar suddenly felt himself under the Master Mage's gaze again. He felt like a beetle again, but this time one that had inadvertently crawled across the bug collector's work desk. The flames had already consumed half the letter of introduction, and the wax seal was already melting, dripping onto the observatory's flagstones. Khadgar was aware that his eyes were wide, his face bloodless and pale, his mouth hanging open. He tried to force the air out of his body, but all he managed was a strangled hissing sound. The dark, heavy brows pursued in the bemused glance. "Are you ill? Morose, is this lad ill?" "Winded, perhaps," said Morose in a level tone. "Was a long climb up." Khadgar finally managed to gather his sense about him sufficiently to say, "The letter!" "Ah," said Medivh. "Yes, thank you, I'd almost forgotten." He walked over to the brazier and dropped the burning parchment on top of the coals. The blue ball of flame rose spectacularly to about shoulder height, then diminished to a normal-looking flame, filling the small room with warmth, reddish glow. Of the letter of introduction, with its parchment and crimson seal inscribed with the symbol of Kirin Tor, there was no sign. "But you didn't read it," said Khadgar, and caught himself. "I mean, sir, with respect." The Master Mage chuckled and settled himself into a large chair made of canvas and dark carved wood. The brazier lit his face, pulling out the deep lines formed into a smile. Despite this, Khadgar could not relax. Medivh leaned forward in his chair and said, "Oh, great and respected Magus Medivh, Master Mage of Karazhan, I bring you the greetings of the Kirin Tor, most learned in pursuit of the magical academics, guilds, and societies, advisors to the kings, teachers of the learned, revealers of secrets." They continue in that fashion for some ways, puffing themselves up more with every sentence. How am I doing so far? "I couldn't say," said Khadgar. "I was instructed not to open the letter," finished Medivh. "But you did anyways." The Master Mage raised his eyebrow to regard the young man, and Khadgar's breath caught in his throat. Something flickered in Medivh's eyes, and Khadgar wondered if the Master Mage had the power to cast spells without anyone noticing. Khadgar slowly nodded, steeling himself for the response. Medivh chuckled loudly. When? On the voyage from Lordaeron to Kotaras, said Khadgar, unsure if what he was said would amuse or irritate his potential mentor. We were beclaimed for 2 days, and curiosity got the better of you. Finished Medivh again. He smiled, and it was a clean white smile beneath a graying beard. I probably would have opened it the moment I got out of sight of the Dardaron's Violet Citadel. Khadgar took a deep breath and said, I considered that, but I believe they had divination spells in operation, at least at that range. And you wanted to be far away from any spell or message recalling you for opening the letter. And you patched it back together well enough to fool a cursory examination. Sure that I would likely break the seal straight away and not notice your tampering. Medivh allowed himself a chuckle, but drew his face into a tight, focused knot. How did I do at that? He asked. Khadgar blinked. Do what, sir? Know what was in the letter, said Medivh, the sides of his mouth tugging down. The letter I just burned says that will find this young man Khadgar most impressive in his deduction and his intelligence. Impress me. Khadgar looked at Medivh, and the jovial smile of a few seconds before had evaporated. His smiling face was now that of some primitive stone god, judgmental and unforgiving. The eyes that had been tinged with mirth earlier now seemed to be barely concealing some hidden fury. The burrows knotted together like the rising thunderhead of a storm. Khadgar stammered for a moment, but then said, You read my mind. Possible, said Medivh, but incorrect. You're a strew of nerves right now, and that gets in the way of mind reading. One wrong. You've gotten this sort of letter before, said Khadgar, from the Kirin Tor. You know what kind of letters are written. Also possible, said the Master Mage, as I have received such letters, and they do tend to be overwhelming in their self-congratulatory tone. But you know the exact wording as well as I do. A good try, and the most obvious, but also incorrect. Too wrong. Khadgar's mouth formed into a tight line. His mind raised, and his heart thundered in his chest. Sympathy, he said at last. Medivh's eyes remained unreadable, and his voice level. Explain. Khadgar took a deep breath. One of the magical laws. When someone handles an item, they leave a part of their own magical aura or vibration attached to the item. As auras vary with individuals, it is possible to connect to one by affecting the other. In this way, a lock of hair may be used in a love charm, or a coin may be tracked to its original owner. Medivh's eyes narrowed slightly and dragged a finger across his bearded chin. Continue. Khadgar stopped for a moment, feeling the weight of Medivh's eyes pressing on him. That was what he knew from his lectures. He was halfway there, but how did Medivh use it to figure it out? The more someone uses an item, the stronger the resonance, said Khadgar quickly. So, therefore, an item that expresses a lot of handling or attention will have a stronger sympathy. The words were coming together, tighter and more rapidly now. So a document with which someone had written has more of an aura on it than a blank piece of parchment, and the person is concentrating on what they're writing. So, Khadgar let his thoughts catch up for a moment. You were mind reading, but not my mind. The mind of the scribe who wrote the letter, at the time he was writing it. You picked up his thoughts, reinforcing the words. Without having to physically open the document, said Medivh, and the light danced within his eyes again. So how would this trick be useful to a scholar? Khadgar blinked for a moment, and looked away from the Master Mage, seeking to avoid his piercing gaze. You could read books without having to read books. Very valuable for a researcher, said Medivh. You belong to a community of scholars. Why don't you do that? Because Khadgar thought of old Corrigan, who could find anything in the library, even with the smallest marginal notation. I think we do, but for older members of the Conclave. Medivh nodded. And that is because? Khadgar thought for a moment, then shook his head. Who would write if all the knowledge could be sucked out with a mental twist and a burst of magic? Who would write if all the knowledge could be sucked out with a mental twist or a burst of magic? Suggested Medivh. He smiled, and Khadgar realized he had been holding his breath. You're not bad. Not bad at all. You know your counterspells? To the 5th roster, said Khadgar. Can you power a mystic bolt? Asked Medivh quickly. 1 or 2, but it's draining, answered the young man, suddenly feeling that the conversation had taken a serious turn once more. And your primary elementals? Strongest in flame, but I know them all. Nature magic? Asked Medivh. Ripening, culling, harvesting. Can you take a seed and pull the youth from it until it becomes a flower? No, sir. I was trained in the city. Can you make a homunculus? Dr. Ent frowns on it, but I understand the principles involved, said Khadgar, if you're curious. Medivh's eyes lit up for a moment, and he said, You sailed here from Lordaeron. What type of boat? Khadgar felt thrown for a moment by the sudden change of discussion. Yes, a Thracian windrunner, the Gracious Breeze, he replied. Out of Kulturas, concluded Medivh. Human crew? Yes. You spoke with the crew at all? Again, Khadgar felt himself sliding once more from conversation into interrogation. A little. I think I amused them with my accent. The crews of the Kulturas ships are easily amused, said Medivh. Any non-human on the crew? No, sir, said Khadgar. The Thracians told stories of fishmen. They call them Murlocs. Are they real? They are, said the Magus. What other races have you encountered, other than variations of human? Some gnomes were in Dalaran once, said Khadgar, and I've met dwarven artificers at the Violet Citadel. I know dragons from legends. I saw the dragon's skull in one of the academics once. What about trolls or goblins? Said Medivh. Trolls, said Khadgar. 4 known variations of trolls. There may be a 5th. That would be the Brashwa Alonda teaches, murmured Medivh, but mentioned for Khadgar to continue. Trolls are savage, larger than humans, very tall and wiry, with elongated features. He thought for a moment. Tribal organizations, almost completely removed from civilized lands, almost distinct in Lordaeron. Goblins? Much smaller, more size of dwarves, just as inventive, but in a destructive fashion. Fearless, I have read that as a race they are insane. Only the smart ones, said Medivh. You know about hmm. You know about demons? Of course, sir, said Khadgar quickly. I mean, from legends, sir. And I know the proper abjurations and protections. All mages of Dalaran are taught so from our first day of training. But you've never summoned one, said Medivh. Or been present when someone else did so? Khadgar blinked, wondering if this was a trick question. No, sir, I wouldn't even think of it. I do not doubt that you wouldn't, said the Magus, and there was the slightest edge to his voice. Think of it, that is. Do you know what a guardian is? A guardian? Khadgar, Khadgar suddenly felt the conversation take yet another left-hand turn. A watchman, a guard, perhaps another race? Is it a type of monster? Perhaps a protector against monsters? Medivh smiled now and shook his head. Don't worry. You're not supposed to know. You're not supposed to know. It's part of the trick. Then he looked up and said, So what do you know of me? Khadgar shot a glance towards Morose, the Castilian, and suddenly realized that the servant had vanished, fading back into the shadows. The young man stammered for a moment. The mages of Kirin Tor hold you in high regard, he managed at last, diplomatically. Obviously, he said brusquely. You are a powerful, independent mage, supposedly an advisor to King Lane of Azeroth. We go back, said Medivh, nodding at the youth. Beyond that, Khadgar hesitated, wondering if the mage truly could read his mind. Yes. Nothing specific to justify the high esteem, said Khadgar. And fear. And envy, finished Khadgar. Feeling suddenly put upon by the questions, unsure about how to answer, he quickly added, Nothing specific to explain directly the high respect the Kirin Tor holds you in. It's supposed to be that way, snapped Medivh peevishly, rubbing his hands over the brazier. It's supposed to be that way. Khadgar could not believe how the Master Mage could possibly be cold. Ha ha. Wait, Claws. See? He himself felt nervous, sweat dripped down his back. At length, Medivh looked up, and the brewing storm was in his eyes again. But what do you know about me? Nothing, sir, said Khadgar. Nothing? Medivh's voice raised and seemed to reverberate across the observatory. Nothing? You came all this way for nothing. You didn't even bother to check. Perhaps I was just an excuse for your masters to get rid of you out of their hair, hoping you'd die en route. Wouldn't be the first time someone tried that. There wasn't that much to check. You haven't done much, responded Khadgar hotly, then took a deep breath, realizing whom he was speaking with and what he was saying. I mean, not much that I could find out, He expected an outburst from the older mage, but Medivh just chuckled. And what did you find out? He asked. Khadgar sighed and said, You come from a Sparecaster heritage. Your father was a mage of Azeroth, one Nihilus Aran. Your mother was Egwin, which may be a title as opposed to a name, one that goes back at least 800 years. You grew up in Azeroth and know King Lane and Lord Lothar from your childhood. Beyond that, Khadgar let his voice trail off. Nothing. Medivh looked into the brazier and nodded. Well, That is something, more than most people can find out. And your name means Keeper of Secrets, Kagar added. In High Elven. I found that out as well. All too true, said Medivh, looking suddenly tired. He stared into the brazier for a while. Egwin is not a title, he said at length. It is merely my mother's name. Then there were several Egwins, probably a family name, suggested Kagar. Oh, only one, said Medivh, stubbornly. Kagar gave a nervous laughter. But that would make her over 750 years old when I was born, said Medivh, with a surprising snort. She is much older than I. She is much older than that. I was a late child in her life, which may be one reason the Kirintor is interested in what I keep in my library, which is why they sent you to find out. Sir? Said Kagar, as sternly as he could manage. To be honest, every mage, save the highest in the Kirintor, wants me to find something from something from you. I will accommodate them as best I'm able, but if there is material that you wish to keep restricted or hidden, I will fully understand. If I thought that, you would not have gone through the forest to reach here, said Medivh, suddenly serious. I need someone to sort and organize the library, for starters. Then, we work on the alchemical laboratories. Yes, you'll do nicely. You see, I know the meaning of your name just as you know mine. Morose? Here, sir, said the servant, suddenly manifesting out of the shadows. Despite himself, Kagar jumped. Take the lad down to his quarters and make sure he eats something. It's been a long day for him. Of course, sir, said Morose. One question, master, said Kagar, catching himself. I mean, Lord Magus, sir. Call me Medivh, for now. I also answer to Keeper of Secrets, and a few other names. Not all of them known. What do you mean when you said you know my name? Asked Kagar. Medivh smiled, and the room suddenly seemed warm and cozy again. You don't speak Dwarven, he observed. Kagar shook his head. My name means Keeper of Secrets in High Elven. Your name means Trust in the Old Dwarven language. So I will hold you to your name, young Kagar, young Trust. Morose saw the young man to his quarters halfway down the tower, explaining in a ghostly, definitive voice that as he shuffled down the stairs, meals in Medivh's tower were simple fare. Porridge and sausage for breakfast, a cold lunch, and a large hearty dinner, usually stew or a roast served with vegetables. Cook would retire after the evening meals, but there was always leftovers in the cold room. Medivh kept hours that could be charitably described as erratic. Morose and Cook had long since learned how to accommodate him, with a minimal amount of hardship on their parts. Morose informed young Kagar that, as an assistant instead of a servant, he would not have that luxury. He would be expected to be available to help the Master Mage whenever he deemed it necessary. I, I'd expect that as an apprentice, said Kagar. Morose turned in mid-step. They were walking along an upper gallery overlooking what seemed to be a reception hall or ballroom. Not an apprentice yet, lad, wheezed Morose. Not even by half. But Medivh said, you could sort out the library, said Morose. Assistant work, not apprentices. Others have been assistants. None have been apprentices. Kagar's brow furrowed, and he felt the warmth of blush on his face. He had not expected there to be a level before apprentice in the mages' hierarchy. How long before? Couldn't say, really, gasped the servant. None have ever made it this far. Hagar thought of two questions at once, hesitated, then asked, how many other assistants have there been? Morose looked over the gallery railing, and his eyes grew unfocused. Hagar wondered if the servant was thinking or had been derailed by the question. The gallery below was sparsely furnished with a heavy central table and chairs. It was surprisingly uncluttered, and Kagar surmised that Medivh did not hold many banquets. Dozens, said Morose at last. At least. Most of them from Azeroth. An elfling or... no, two elflings. You're the first from the Kirin Tor. Dozens? Repeated Kagar, his heart sinking as he wondered how many times Medivh had welcomed a young would-be mage into his service. He asked the other question. How long did they last? Morose snorted this time and said, days. Sometimes hours. One elf didn't even make it up the tower stairs. He tapped the blinders at the side of his wizened head. They see things, you know. Kagar thought the figure at the main gate and just nodded. At last they arrived at Kagar's quarters, in a side passage not far from the banquet hall. Tidy yourself up, said Morose, handing Kagar the lantern. The jake's at the end of the hall. There's a pot beneath the bed. Come down to the kitchen. Cook will have something warm for you. Kagar's room was a narrow wedge of the tower, more suitable to the contemplations of contemplations of a cloistered monk than a mage. A narrow bed along one wall, and an equally narrow desk along the other, with a bare shelf above. A standing closet for clothes. Kagar tossed his rucksack into the closet without opening it and walked over to the thin window. The window was a slim slice of leading glass, mounted vertically on a pivot in the center. Kagar pushed on one half and it slowly pushed open, solidifying oil in the bottom mount oozing as the window rotated. The view was from still high in the tower's side, and the rounded hills that surrounded the tower were gray and bare in the light of the twin moons. From his height, it was obvious to Kagar that the hills had once been a crater, worn and weathered by the passage of years. Had some mountain been pulled from this spot like a rooted tooth? Or maybe the ring of the hills had not risen at all, but rather the rest of the surrounding mountains had risen faster, leaving only this place of power rooted in the spot. Kagar wondered if Medivh's mother was here when the land rose, or sank, or was struck by a piece of the sky. 800 years was long even by the standards of a wizard. After 200 years, most of the old object lessons taught most human mages were deathly thin and frail. To be 750 years old and bear a child? Kagar shook his head and wondered if Medivh was having him on. Kagar shed his travel cloak and visited the facilities at the end of the hall. They were Spartan, but included a pitcher of cold water in a wash basin and a good, untarnished mirror. Kagar thought of using a minor spell to heat the water, then decided merely to tough it out. The water was bracing, and Kagar felt better as he changed into less dusty togs, a comfortable shirt that reached nearly to his knees, and a set of sturdy pants. His working gear, he pulled a narrow eating knife from his sack, and after a moment's thought, slid it into the side of his sleeve of one boot. He stepped back out into the hallway and realized they had no clear idea where the kitchen was. There had been no cooking shed out by the stables, so whatever arrangements were likely within the tower, perhaps on or near the ground level, with a pump from the well, with a clear path to the banquet hall, whether or not the hall was commonly used. Khadgar found the gallery above the banquet hall, easily enough, but had to search to find the staircase, narrow and twisting in on itself, leading to it. From the banquet hall himself, he had a choice of exits. Khadgar chose the most likely one and ended up in a dead-end hallway with empty rooms on all sides, similar to his own. A second choice brought him to a similar result. The third led the young man to the heat of battle. He did not expect it. One moment he was starting down a set of low flagging steps, wondering if he needed a map or a bell or a hunting horn to navigate the tower. The next moment, the roof above him opened up into a brilliant sky, the color of fresh blood, and he was surrounded by men in armor, armed for battle. Khadgar stepped back, but the hallway had vanished behind him, only leaving an uneven, barren landscape unlike any he was familiar with. The men were shouting and pointing, but their voices, despite the fact that they were right next to Khadgar, were indistinct and muddied, like they were talking to him from underwater. A dream? Thought Khadgar. Perhaps he had laid down for a moment and fallen asleep, and all this was some night terror brought on by his own concerns. But no. He could almost feel the heat of the dying, corpulent sun on his flesh, and the breeze and the shouting men moved around him. It was as if he had become unstuck from the rest of the world, occupied his own small island, with only the most tenuous of connections to the reality around him, as if he had become a ghost. Indeed, the soldiers ignored him as if he were a spirit. Khadgar reached out to grab one on the shoulder, and to his own relief, the hand did not pass through the battered shoulder plates. There was resistance, but only of the most abhorrous sorts. He could feel the solidarity of the armor, and if he concentrated, feel the rough ridges of the dimpled metal. These men had fought, Khadgar realized, both hard and recently. Only one man in three was without some form of rude bandage, blood-stained badges of war sticking out from beneath dirty armor and damaged helms. The weapons were notched as well, and spattered with dried crimson. He had fallen into a battlefield. Khadgar examined their positions. They were atop a small hillock, a mere fold in the undulating plains that seemed to surround them. Where vegetation existed had been chopped down and formed into crude battlements, now guarded by grim-faced men. This was no safe redoubt, no castle or fort. They had chosen this spot to fight only because there was no other available to them. The soldiers parted as their apparent leader, a great white-bearded man with broad shoulders, pushed his way through. His armor was battered as any, but consisted of breastplate bolted over a crimson set of scholars' robes, of the type that would not have been out of place in the halls of the Kirin Tor. The hem, sleeves, and the vest of these crimson robes were inscribed with runes of power, some of which Khadgar recognized, but others which seemed alien to him. The leader's snowy beard reached almost to his waist, obscuring the armor beneath, and he wore a red skull cap with a single golden gem in the brow. He held a gem-tipped staff in one hand and a dark red sword in the other. The leader was bellowing at the soldiers in a voice that sounded to Khadgar like the raging sea itself. The warriors seemed to know what he was saying, though, for they formed themselves up nearly along the barricades, others filling gaps along the line. The snow-bearded commander brushed past Khadgar, and despite the youth, stumbled back out of the way. The commander should not have noticed him, no more than any of the blood-spattered warriors had. Yet the commander did. His voice dropped for a moment. He stammered. His foot landed badly on an uneven soil of the rocky hilltop, and he almost stumbled. Yet instead he turned and regarded Khadgar. Yes, he looked at Khadgar, and it was clear to the would-be apprentice that the ancient mage warrior saw him, and saw him clearly. The commander's eyes looked deeply into Khadgar's own, and for a moment Khadgar felt as if he was under Medivh's own withering glare earlier. Yet, if anything, this was more intense. Khadgar looked into the eyes of the commander, and what he saw there made him gasp. Despite himself, he turned away, breaking the locked gaze with the mage warrior. When Khadgar looked up at him again, the commander was nodding at him. It was a brief, almost dismissive nod, and the old man's mouth was a tight frown. Then the snow-bearded leader was off again, bellowing at the warriors, entreating them to defend themselves. Khadgar wanted to go after him, to chase him down and find out how he could have seen him when others did not, and what he could tell him. But there was a cry around him, a muddy cry of tired men called into duty one last time. Swords and spears were raised to a sky the shade of curdled blood, and arms pointed towards the nearby ridges where flooding had stripped out patterns of purple against the rusty-colored soil. Khadgar looked where the men were pointing, and a wave of green and black topped the nearest ridge. Khadgar thought it was some river or an arcane and colorful mud flow, but he realized the wave was an advancing army. Black was the color of their armor, green was the color of their flesh. They were nightmare creatures, mockeries of human form. Their jade-fleshed faces were dominated by heavy underslug jaws lined with fanged teeth, the nose flat and sniffing like a dog's, and their eyes small, bloody, and filled with hate. Their ebon weapons and ornate armor shone in the in, in the eternally dying sun of this world, and as they topped the rise, they let out a bellow that rocked the ground beneath them. The soldiers around them let out a cry of their own, and as the green creatures closed the distance between the hills, they let out a volley after volley of red-fletched arrows. The front line of monstrous creatures stumbled and fell, and were immediately trampled by those who came behind. Another volley, and another rank of the inhuman monsters toppled, yet their failing was subsided by the advancing tide of the mass that followed. To Khadgar's right, there were flashes as lightning danced across the surface of the earth, and the monstrosities screamed as the flesh was boiled from the bones. Khadgar thought of the warrior mage commander, but also realized that those bolts only thinned the charging hordes by the merest fraction. And then the green-fleshed monstrosities were on top of them. The wave of ebony and jade smashed against the rude pestilide. The felled timbers were no more than twigs in the path of this storm, and Khadgar could feel the line buckle. One of the soldiers nearest him toppled, impaled by a great, dark spear. In the warrior's place there was a nightmare of green flesh and black armor, howling as it swept down upon him. Despite himself, Khadgar backed 2 steps, then turned to run, and almost slammed into Morose, who was standing in the archway. "You," wheezed Morose calmly, "were late. Might have gotten lost." Khadgar wheeled again in place and saw that behind him was not a world of crimson skies and green monstrosities, but an abandoned sitting room. Its fireplace empty, and its chairs covered with drop cloths. The air smelled of dust, only recently disturbed. "I was..." Gaska. "I saw... I was..." "Misplaced?" suggested Morose. Kagar gulped, looked about, then nodded mutely. Late. Supper is ready, groaned Morose. Don't get misplaced again now. And the dark-clad servant turned and glided quietly out of the room. Kagar took one last look at the dead-end passage he had stumbled into. There was no mystic archway or magical doorways. The vision, if vision it was, had ended with a suddenness only to be equaled by its beginning. There were no soldiers, no creatures with green flesh, no army about to collapse. There was only a memory that scared Khadgar to his core. It was real. It had felt real. It had felt true. It was not the monsters or the bloodshed that had frightened him. It was the mage warrior, the snow-white-haired commander that seemed to be able to see him, that seemed to have looked into the heart of him and find him wanting. And worst of all, the white bearded figure in armor and robes had Kagar's eyes. His face was aged, the hair snow-white, the manner powerful, yet the commander had the same eyes that Kagar had seen in the untarnished mirror just moments, lifetimes before. Kagar left the same room and wondered if it would not be too late to get a set of blinders. Chapter 3. Settling in. We'll start you off slow, said the elder wizard from across the table. Take stock of the library. Figure out how you're going to organize it. Kagar nodded over the porridge and sausage. The bulk of the breakfast conversation was about Darlaron in general. What was popular in Darlaron? What were the fashions of Lordaeron? What were they arguing about in the halls of the Kirin Tor? Kagar mentioned that the current philosophical question when he left was whether, when you created a flame by magic, you called it into being or summoned it from some parallel existence. Medivh huffed over breakfast. Fools! They wouldn't know an alternate dimension if it came and bit them on the... So what do you think? I think... And Kagar suddenly realized he was once again on the spot. I think it may be something else entirely different. Excellent, said Medivh, smiling. When given a choice between two, choose the third. Of course, you meant to say when you create fire, all you're doing is concentrating the inherent nature of fire contained in the surrounding areas to one location, calling it to being. Ah, yes, not adding. I had thought about it for a while, like a few years. Good, said Medivh, dabbing at his beard with a napkin. You have a quick mind and an honest appraisal of yourself. Let's see how you do with the library. Morose will show you the way. The library occupied 2 levels, and was situated about a third of the way up the tower itself. The staircase along this part of the tower hugged the outside edge of the citadel, leaving a large chamber 2 floors high. A wrought iron platform created an upper gallery on the second level. The room's narrow windows were covered with interwoven rods of iron, reducing what natural light the room had to little more than that of a hooded torch. On the great oak tables of the first level, crystalline globes covered in a thick pareta of dust glowed with a blue-gray luster. The room itself was a disaster area. Books were scattered open to random pages, scrolls were unspoiled over chairs, and a thin layer of dusty foul scrape covered everything like the leaves on the forest floor. The more ancient tomes, still chained to the bookshelves, had been unshelved and hung from their links like prisoners in some dungeon cell. Kagar surveyed the damage and let out a deep sigh. Start me off slow, he said. I could have your gear packed in an hour, said Morose from the hallway. The servant would not enter the library proper. Kagar picked up a piece of parchment at his feet. One side was a demand from the Kirin Tor for the Master Mage to respond to their most recent missive. The other side was marked with a dark crimson smear that Kagar assumed was at first was blood, but realized nothing more than the melted wax seal. "No," said Kagar, panting his small pouch of scribe tools. "It is just more of a challenge than I at first anticipated." "Heard that before," said Morose. Kagar turned to ask about his comment, but the servant had already gone from the doorway. With the care of a burglar, Kagar picked his way through the debris. It was as if a battle had erupted in the library. Spines were broken, covers were pulled from bindings entirely, and this was for those books that were still mostly whole. More portfolios had been pulled from other covers, and the dust on the tables covered a layer of papers and correspondence. Some of these were open, but some were noticeably still unread. The knowledge contained beneath the wax seal. The Magus doesn't need an assistant," muttered Kagar, clearing a space at the end of one table and pulling out a chair. "He needs a housekeeper." He shot a glance up at the doorway to make sure that the Castilian was well and truly gone. Kagar sat down, and the chair rocked severely. He stood up again and saw that the uneven legs had shifted off a thick tome with a metallic cover. The front cover was ornate, and the page edges clad in silver. Kagar opened the text, and as he did so, he felt something shift within the book, like a slider moving down a metal rod or a drop of mercury moving through a glass pipe. Something metallic unwound within a spine of the tome. The book began to tick. Quickly, Kagar closed the cover, and the book silenced itself with a sharp whir and a snap, its mechanism resetting. The young man delicately set the volume back on the table. That was when he noticed the scorch marks on the chair he was using and the floor beneath it. "I can see why you go through so many assistants," said Kagar, slowly wandering through the room. The situation did not improve. Books were hanging open over the arms of chairs and metal railings. The correspondence grew deeper as he moved further into the room. Something had made a nest in one of the corners of the bookshelves, and as Kagar pulled it from the shelf, a small shrew's skull toppled out, crumbling when it struck the floor. The upper level was little more than storage. Books not even reaching the shelves, just piled in higher stacks, foothills leading to mountains leading to an unattainable peaks. There was one bare spot, but this looked like someone had started a fire in a desperate attempt to reduce the amount of paper present. Kagar examined the area and shook his head. Something else burned here as well, for there were bits of fabric, probably from a scholar's robe. Kagar shook his head and went back to where he had left his scribe's tools and spelled out a thin wooden pen with a handful of metal nibs, a stone sharpening, and a sharpening. He spelled out a thin wooden pen with a handful of metal nibs, a stone for sharpening and shaping the nibs, a knife with a flexible blade for scraping, parchment, a block of octopus ink, a small dish in which to melt the ink, a collection of thin, flat keys, a magnifying lens, and what looked at first glance like a metallic cricket. He picked up the cricket, turned it on its back, and using a specially fashioned pen nib, wound it up. A gift from Guzba upon Kagar completing his first training as a scribe. It had proven invaluable in the use preambitions among the halls of Kirin Tor. Within was contained a simple but effective spell that would warn when a trap was in the offering. As soon as he wound it, one revolution, the metallic cricket let out a high-pitched squeal. Kagar's surprise almost dropped the detecting insect. Then he realized that the device was merely warning him about the intensity of the potential danger. Khadgar looked at the pile of volumes around him and muttered a low curse. He retreated to the doorway and finished winding the crickets. Then he brought the first book he picked up, the ticking one, over to the doorway. The cricket warbled slightly. Khadgar set the trap book to one side of the doorway. He picked up another volume and brought it over. The cricket was silent. Khadgar held his breath, hoped that the cricket was enchanted to handle all forms of traps, magical and otherwise, and opened the book. It was a treatise written in soft feminine hands on the politics of elves from 300 years back. Khadgar set the handwritten volume to the other side of the doorway and went back for another book. "I know you," said Medivh the next morning over sausage and porridge. "Khadgar, sir," said the youth. "New assistant," said the older mage. "Of course, forgive me, but the memory is not everything it once was. Too much going on, I'm afraid." "Anything you need aid with, sir?" asked Khadgar. The elder man seemed to think about it for a moment, then said, "The library. Young Trust. How are things going in the library?" "Good," said Khadgar. "Very good. I'm busy sorting the books and papers." "Ah, by subject? By author?" asked the master mage. Fatal and non-fatal, thought Khadgar. "I'm thinking by subject. Many are anonymous," said Medivh. "Never trust anything that a man will not set his reputation and name upon." "Carry on, then. Tell me, what is the opinion of the Kirintor mages about King Lane? Do they ever mention him?" Work proceeded with glacial slowness, but Medivh did not seem to be aware of the time involved. Indeed, he seemed to start each morning with being mildly and pleasantly surprised that Khadgar was still with them, and after a short summary of the progress, the conversation would switch into new direction. "Speaking of libraries," he would say, what is the Kirintor's librarian Corgan up to? How do people in Lordaeron feel about elves? Have they ever been seen there in living memory? Are there any legends of a bull-headed man in the halls of the Violent Citadel?" And one morning, about a week into Khadgar's stay, Medivh was not present at all. "Gone," said Morose simply when asked. "Gone where?" asked Khadgar. The old castellan shrugged, and Khadgar could almost hear the bones clattering within his form. "He's not one to say." "What is he doing?" pressed Khadgar. "Not one to say." "When will he be back?" "Not one to say." "He would leave me alone in his tower?" asked Khadgar. "Unsupervised with all his mystic texts?" "Could come stand guard over you," volunteered Morose, "if that is what you want." Khadgar shook his head, but said, "Morose." "Yep, young sir." "These visions," started the young man. "Blinders," suggested the servant. Khadgar shook his head again. "Do they show the future or the past?" "Both, when I've noticed, but I don't usually notice," said Morose. "Notice, that is." "And ones of the future, do they come true?" said the young man. Morose let out what Khadgar could only assume was a deep sigh, a bone-rattling exhalation. "In my experience, yes, young sir. In one vision, Cook saw me break a piece of crystal, so he hid them away. Months passed, and finally the master asked for that piece of crystal. She removed it from its hiding place, and within 2 minutes I had broken it. Completely unintentional. He said. He sighed. He sighed again. She got her rose quartz lenses the next day. Will there be anything else? Kagar said no, but was troubled as he climbed the staircase to the library level. He'd gone as far as he had dared so far in his organization, and Medivh's sudden disappearance left him high and dry without further direction. The young would-be apprentice entered the library. On one side of the room there were the volumes and remains of volumes that Cricket had deemed were safe, while the other half of the room was filled with generally more complete volumes that were noted as being trapped. The great tables were covered with loose pages and unopened correspondence laid out in two similar semi-regular heaps. The shelves were entirely bare, the chains hanging empty of their prisoners. Kagar could sort through the papers, but better to restock the shelves with the books. But most of the volumes were untitled, or if titled, their covers so bare, worn, scuffled, and torn to be illegible. The only way to determine contents would be to open the books, which would set off the trapped ones. Kagar looked at the scorch marks on the floor and shook his head. Then he started looking first among the trapped volumes, then among the untrapped ones, until he found what he was looking for. A book marked with the symbol of a key. It was locked, a thick metal band holding it closed, secured by a lock. Nowhere in his searching had Kagar come across a real key, though that did not surprise him, given the organization of the room. The binding was strong, and the cover itself was a metal plate bound in red leather. Kagar pulled the flat piece of the key from his pouch, but they were all insufficient for the large lock. Finally, using the tip of his scraping knife, Kagar managed to thread the silver of the metal through the lock, and it gave a satisfying click as he drove it home. Kagar looked at the cricket he kept on the table. It was still silent. Holding his breath, the young mage opened the heavy volume. The sour smell of decayed paper rose to his nostrils. Of traps and locks, he said out loud, wrapping his mouth around the archaic script and overvowed words. Being a treatise on the nature of securing devices. Kagar pulled up a chair, slightly lower as he sawed off the three long legs to balance it, and began to read. Medivh was gone a full 2 weeks, and by the time Kagar had claimed the library as his own. Each morning he rose for breakfast, gave Morose a perfunctory update as to his progress, which the Castellan as well as the cook never gave any indication of curiosity about, then buried himself away within the vault. Lunch and supper were brought to him, and he often worked into the night by soft brushing light from the glowing balls. He adjusted to the nature of the tower well. There were often images that hung in the corner of his eye, just a twinkling of a figure in a tattered cloak that would evaporate when he looked at it. A half-finished word that drifted in the air, and suddenly coldness, as if a door or window had been left open, or sudden change of pressure, as if a hidden entrance had suddenly appeared. Sometimes the tower groaned in the wind, the ancient stones shifting on each other after centuries of construction. Slowly he learned the nature, if not the exact contents, of the books that were within the library, foiling the traps that were placed around the most valuable tomes. His research served him well in the last case. He soon became an expert at foiling spell mechanisms and weighted traps, as he had been with the locked doors and hidden secrets in Darlaron. The trick for most of them was to convince the locking mechanism, whether magical or mechanical in nature, that the lock had not been foiled, when in reality it had been. Determining what set off the particular trap off, whether it was weight or a shifting bit of metal or even exposure to the sun or fresh air, was half the battle to defeating it. There were books that were beyond him, whose looks foiled even his modified picks and dexterous knife. Those went to the highest level, toward the back, and Khadgar resolved to find out what was within them, either on his own or by threading the knowledge out of Medivh. He doubted the latter, and wondered if the Master Mage had used the library as anything else but a dumping ground for his inherent texts and old letters. Most of the Mages of the Kirin Tor had at least some semblance of order to their archives, with their most valuable tomes hidden away. But Medivh had everything in a hodgepodge, as if he hadn't really needed them. Except as a test, thought Khadgar. A test to keep would-be apprentices at bay. One secured with chains on the upper level, while more common military histories, acclimates, and diaries were on the lower floor. Here were the scrolls as well, ranging from mundane listings of items brought and sold in Stormwind to recording of epic poems. The last were particularly interested, since a few of them were about Egwene, Medivh's claimed mother. If she lived over 800 years, she must have been a powerful mage indeed, thought Khadgar. More information about her would likely be in the protected books in the back. So far, those tombs have resisted every common entry and physical attempt to step aside the locks and traps, and the detecting cricket particularly mewed in horror whenever he attempted to unlock them. Still, there was more than enough to do with categorizing the loose pieces, reassembling those volumes which age had almost destroyed, and sorting, or at least reading, most of the correspondence. Some of the latter was in Elven script, and even more of it, from a variety of sources, was in some sort of cipher. The latter type came with a variety of seals upon it, from both Azeroth, Cosmodan, and Lordaeron, as well as places that Khadgar could not locate in the Atlas. A large group communicated in cipher with each other and with Medivh himself. There were several ancient grimoires on code, most of them dealing with letters replacement and cant. Nothing compared to the code used in these ciphers. Perhaps they were using a combination method to create their own. As a result, Khadgar had the grimoires on code, along with primers in Elven and Dwarven languages, open on the table the evening that Medivh suddenly returned to the tower. Khadgar didn't hear him as much as felt his sudden presence, the way the air changes as a storm front bears across the farmland. The young mage turned in his chair, and there was Medivh, his broad shoulders filling the doorway, his robes billowing behind him of their own volition. "Sir, I—" started Khadgar, smiling and half risen from the chair. Then he saw the Master Mage's hair was in disarray, and her lambent green eyes were wide and angry. "There! Thief!" shouted Medivh, pointing at Khadgar. "Interloper!" The elder mage pointed at the younger and began to intone a string of alien symbolized words not crafted for the human throat. Despite himself, Khadgar raised a hand and wove a symbol of protection in the air in front of him. But he might as well have been making a rude hand gesture for all the effort it had on Medivh's spell. A wall of solidified air slammed into the younger man, bowling over both him and the chair he sat in. The grimoires and primers were skidding across the surface of the table like boats caught in a sudden squall, and the notes danced away spinning. Surprised, Khadgar was driven back, slammed into one of the bookshelves behind him. The shelf itself rocked from the force of the blow, and the youth was afraid it would topple, spoiling his hard work. The bookcase held its position, though, and the pressure on Khadgar's chest from the force of the attack intensified. "Who are you?" thundered Medivh. "What are you doing here?" The young mage struggled against the weight on his chair and managed to speak. Khadgar, he gasped. "Assistant, clean, library, your orders." Part of his mind wondered if this is why Moreau spoke in such a shorthand fashion. Medivh blinked at Khadgar's word and straightened like a man who had just been awoken from a deep sleep. He twisted his hand slightly, and at once the wave of solidified air evaporated. Khadgar dropped to his knees, gasping for air. Medivh crossed to him and helped him to his feet. "I'm sorry, lad," he began. "I have forgotten you were still here. I assumed you were a thief." "A thief that insisted on leaving the room neater than he found it," said Khadgar. It hurt a little to be when he breathed. "Yes," said Medivh, looking around the room and nodding despite the disruption his own attack had caused. Yes, I don't believe anyone has ever gotten this far before." "I've sorted by type," said Khadgar, still bent over and grasping his knees. "Histories, including epic poems to your right, natural sciences on your left, legendary material in the center with language and reference books. The more powerful material, alchemical notes, spell descriptions, and theory go on the balcony, along with some books I couldn't identify that seemed fairly powerful. You're going to have a look at those yourself." "Yes," said Medivh, now ignoring the youth and scanning the room. "Excellent. An excellent job. Very good." He looked around, seeming like a man just gained his bearings again. "Very good indeed. You've done well. Now, come along." The master mage bolted for the door, pulling himself short, then turned. "Are you coming?" Khadgar felt as if he had been hit by another mystic bolt. "Coming? Where are we going?" "To the top," said Medivh curtly. "Come now, or it will be too late. Time is of the essence." For an older man, Medivh moved swiftly up the stairs, covering them two at a time at a brisk pace. "What is at the top?" gasped Khadgar, finally catching up at the landing near the top. "Transport," snapped Medivh, then hesitated for a moment. He turned in place and his shoulders dropped. For a moment it looked like the fire had burned out of his eyes. "I must apologize for back there." "Sir?" said Khadgar, his mind now spinning with his new transformation. "My memory is not all it once was, young trust," said the magus. "I should have remembered you were in the tower. With everything, I assumed you must have been a—" "Sir," interrupted Khadgar. "Time is of the essence?" "Time," said Medivh, and then nodded, and the intensity returned to his face. "Yes, it is. Come now, don't lollygag." And with that, the older man was up on his feet and taking the steps two at a time. Khadgar realized that the haunted tower and the disorganized library were not the only reason people left Medivh's employ, and hastened after him. The aged Castilian was waiting for them at the tower observatory. "Morose!" thundered Medivh as he arrived at the top of the tower. "The golden whistle, if you please." "Yep," said the servant, producing a thin cylinder. Dwarven runes were carved along the cylinder's side, reflecting the lamplight of the room. "Already took the library, sir. Liberty, sir. They are here." "They?" started Khadgar. There was a rustle of great wings overhead. Medivh headed for the ramparts, and Khadgar looked up. Great birds descended from the sky, the wings luminescent in the moonlight. No, not birds, Khadgar realized. Griffins. They had the bodies of great cats, but their heads and front claws were those of a sea eagle, and their wings were golden. Medivh held out a bait and bridle. "Hitch yours up, and we'll go." Khadgar eyed the great beast. The nearest griffin let out a shrieking cry and pawed the flagstone with its clawed foreleg. "I've never—" started the old man. "I don't know." Medivh frowned. "Don't they teach you anything in the Kirin Tour?" I don't have time for this." He raised a finger and muttered a few words, touching Khadgar's forehead. Khadgar stumbled back, shouting in surprise. The elder mage's touch felt as if he were driving a hot iron into his brain. Medivh said, "Now you do know. Set the bait and brattle. Now." Khadgar touched his forehead and let out a surprised gasp. He did know now. How to properly harness a griffin, how to ride one as well, both with saddle and, in the dwarven style, without. He knew how to bank, how to force hover, and most of all, how to prepare for a sudden landing. Khadgar harnessed his griffin, aware that his head throbbed slightly, as if the knowledge now within had to jostle that already within his skull to make room. "Ready? Follow." And Medivh, not asking for a response. The pair launched themselves into the air, with great beasts straining and beating the air to allow them to rise. The great creatures could take armored dwarves aloft, but a human in robes approached the limits. Khadgar expertly banked his swooping griffin and followed Medivh as the elder mage swooped down over the dark treetops. The pain in his head spread from the point where Medivh had touched, and now his forehead felt heavy, and his thoughts muzzy. Still, he concentrated and matched the master mage's motions exactly as if he had been flying griffins all his life. The younger mage tried to catch up with Medivh to ask where they were going and what their goal was, but he could not overtake him. Even if he had, Khadgar realized, the rushing wind would drown out all but the greatest shouts. So he followed as the mountains loomed above them, and as the winged beast eastward. How long they flew, Khadgar could not say. He may have dozed off fitfully on the griffin's back, but hands held the reins firm, and the griffin kept pace with his brother creature. Only when Medivh suddenly jinked his griffin to the right did Khadgar shake himself out of his slumber, if slumber it was, and followed the master mage as his course turned south. Khadgar's headache, the likely product of the spell, had almost completely dissipated. Had almost completely dissipated, leaving only a ragged ache as a reminder. They had cleared the mountain range, and Khadgar now realized they were flying over open land, beneath the moonlight. Open land. Beneath them, the moonlight was shattered and reflected on the myriad pools, a large marsh or swamp. Khadgar thought, it had to be early in the morning now, the horizon on their right just starting to lengthen with the eventual promise of day. Medivh dropped low and raised both hands over his head, indicating from Griffinback, Khadgar realized, and though his mind assured him that he knew how to do this, steering the great beast with his knees, he felt his heart as he could never be comfortable in such a maneuver. The creature dropped further than Medivh and suddenly bathed in a ball of light, both liming him clearly and catching Khadgar's griffin as a trailing shadow beneath them. The young man saw an armed encampment on a low rise that jutted from the surrounding swamp. They passed low over the camp, and beneath them Khadgar could hear shouts and the clattering of armor and weapons being hastily grabbed. What was Medivh doing? Passed over the encampment, and Medivh pulled into a high banking turn. Khadgar followed him move for move. They returned over the camp, and it was brighter now. The campfires that had previously been banked were now fed fresh fuel and blazed in the night. Khadgar saw it was a large patrol, perhaps even a company. The commander's tent was large and ornate, and Khadgar recognized the banner of Azeroth's flapping overhead. Allies, then, for Medivh, was supposedly closely linked to both King Lane of Azeroth and Lothar, the kingdom's knight champion. Khadgar expected Medivh to land, but instead the mage kicked the saddle of his mount, pulling the griffin's head up. The beast's great wings beat the dark air, and they climbed again, this time rocketing north. Khadgar had no choice but to follow, as Medivh's light dimmed and the master mage took the reins again. over the marshlands again, and Kagar saw a thin ribbon beneath, too straight for a river, too wide for integration ditch. A road, then, plowed through the swamp, connecting bits of dry land that rose out of the fen. Then the land rose to another ridge, another dry spot, and another encampment. There were also flames in this encampment, but they were not the bright, contained ones of the army's forces. These were scattered throughout the clearing. And as they neared, Kagar realized they were wagons set alight, their contents strewn out among the dark human forms that were tossed like children's dolls on the sandy ground of the campsite. As before, Medivh passed over the campsite and then wheeled high in the air, banking to make a return pass. Kagar followed, the young mage himself leaning over the side of the mount to get a better look. It looked like a caravan that had been looted and set ablaze, but the goods themselves were scattered on the ground. Wouldn't bandits take the booty and the wagon? Where were any survivors? The answer to the last question came with a shout and a volley of arrows that arced up from the brush surrounding the site. The lead griffin let out a shriek as Medivh effortlessly pulled back on the reins, banking the creature clear of the flight of arrows. Kagar attempted the same maneuver, the warm, false, comforting memory in his head telling him that this was the correct way to turn. But unlike Medivh, Kagar was riding too far forward on his mount, and he had insufficient time to pull on the reins. The griffin banked, but not enough to avoid all the arrows. A barbed arrow pierced the feathers of the right wing, and the great beast let out a bleating scream. Jerking in the fight and desperately attempting to beat its wings to get above the arrows, Kagar was off balance and was unable to compensate. In a heartbeat, his hands slipped loose of the reins, and his knees slipped from the side of the griffin. No longer under tight control, the griffin bucked, throwing Kagar entirely free off its back. Kagar lashed out to grab the reins. The leather lines whipped at his fingertips and then were gone into the night, along with his mouth. And Kagar plummeted toward the armed darkness below.